And welcome to the podcast. It's the Godward Show. You're here, and we're talking about Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1836 short story, The Minister's Black Veil. It's only about 7 pages long. I'd really love it if you would just pause this and go listen to the audio version of it somewhere online so you kind of knew better what I was talking about. It's so good. I've returned to this story so many times since I was about 21 years old. First, it was one of the first stories I ever read that really clicked for me and that I wrote a big long 12-page paper about or whatever when I was a sophomore in college. And then I taught it every semester for however many years. And I return to it often in thinking about things that are happening in the world or in my life for different reasons. There seem to be 3 or 4 different kind of main interesting themes in this story. So, okay, first let me just kind of summarize it. I mean, it would, I'm not in 45 minutes. I don't have the time to kind of give you the whole lowdown on Nathaniel Hawthorne and American romance and all that stuff. Although I'll do some of that in a minute maybe. But maybe if you read The Scarlet Letter in high school, that helps a little bit, I suppose. So this particular story, as I said, was published in 1836, but the story is set about 200 years before that in Puritan New England in a little village called Milford, which is southwest of Boston. So that's sort of the setting here. And the story is titled The Minister's Black Veil, but it's subtitled, very interestingly for the purposes of this podcast, A Parable. Okay, so what you've got here is Hawthorne doing his own version of a parable. It's not too long after, the American short story is starting to take form as its own sort of a thing. And I think he really kind of nailed it here. It's maybe not as good as some of his novels, but it's among my favorite of his short stories. So what happens in this story is basically you've got the sexton rings the bell for Sunday morning at church, and everybody starts merrily hopping down the street in their Sunday best, and then they see the Parson Hooper, the minister, and they say, what has he got upon his face? Okay, so what he's got on his face is a black crepe thing that comes down to here, just to in front of his mouth a little bit. Now, the reason I wanted to do this story today and to talk about it, first is because we did the Hawthorne stuff. We've talked about transcendentalism and optimism and the idea of learning to read nature and interpret what you see and that imbuing your life with meaning potentially. And Hawthorne takes really kind of the dark side of that coin, I think. He's going to get us mired into questions of ambiguity and sort of where interpretation comes in. It's not as easy for him as it seems to be for Emerson. But also, the other thing about this, of course, is the mask, basically. And so everybody's out there in the public now wearing these COVID masks. And I've been thinking that, no one seems to be addressing the psychological, the psychological heaviness of seeing people everywhere covering half of their face. And so I thought I would return to this story and see if we can sort of mine from this story, what is it that Hawthorne saw in such an image? He does say at the beginning in his own footnote, by the way, that this story was kind of inspired by a real story of a guy named Mr. Joseph Moody of York, Maine, who I guess was an 18th century minister who did this same thing, who put the veil on his face and then never took it off, which is the gist of the Minister's Black Veil story. But Hawthorne does say in that note, that's not what's going on here. But it says basically he had a different purpose and a different, he accidentally killed an early childhood friend. And so he wore the veil of mourning for the rest of his life. But Hawthorne hints that's not exactly what's going on in this story. It's much more mysterious. So one Sunday morning, Parson Hooper shows up with the veil on his face, and immediately everybody starts speculating about the meaning of it, or the motivation, right? What's going on with Mr. Hooper? People kind of rub their eyes. They're like, is this really happening? What the heck is going on? I think at first they're wondering, maybe he's got a problem with his eyes, or some like kind of like not otherworldly explanation that might just, okay, maybe he'll just wear this today and then it'll go away. The narrator says, Mr. Hooper had on a black veil. On a nearer view, it seemed to consist of 2 folds of crepe, which entirely concealed his features, except the mouth and chin, but probably did not intercept his sight, farther than to give a darkened aspect to all living and inanimate things. So remember, he's looking out through the crepe and can kind of see, although it's all kind of darkened, whereas everybody else looks at him and kind of basically can't see his face. So one of the early reactions is from Goodman Gray, who yells out, "Our parson has gone mad." Okay, so this is, like, again, like, this scene, in this first scene, what you start to get is this really sophisticated meta-fictional commentary on the idea of, like, an object. I mean, this is very vulgar Heideggerianism, I suppose. Here's a thing, right? The veil in this case. And what we have to do is, like, learn to read it, in the sense that Emerson tells us you've got to learn to read the world or nature. It's all, hieroglyphs, right? So, well, let me keep reading here. So Mr. Hooper had ascended the stairs and showed himself in the pulpit, face to face with his congregation, except for the black veil. That mysterious emblem was never once withdrawn from his face. It shook with his measured breath as he gave out the psalm. It threw its obscurity between him and the holy page as he read the scriptures. And while he prayed, the veil lay heavily on his uplifted countenance. And then a credible Hawthorne sentence to end this paragraph. Did he seek to hide it from the dread being whom he was addressing? And it's like, Hawthorne's the author, right? Like, the author here is putting the question to us. It's a really unusual moment, I think, in terms of, like, the narrative perspective, where the author himself doesn't seem to even know what the heck's going on here. He's like asking us, was he just afraid of God? Okay. It says the sermon that day had, excuse me, the sermon that day had something to do with the theme of secret sin. This is fun, right? So secret sin, and those sad mysteries which we hide from our nearest and dearest, and would fain conceal from our own consciousness, even forgetting that the omniscient can detect them. Okay, so that's sort of what's going on with the veil. And then, like, for example, when he finishes the sermon, and it says everybody listened very carefully, okay? When he finishes with the sermon, it says, at the close of the services, people hurried out with indecorous confusion, eager to communicate their pent-up amazement and conscious of lighter spirits the moment they lost sight of the black veil. Some gathered in little circles, huddled closely together, with their mouths all whispering in the center. Some went homeward alone, wrapped in silent meditation. Some talked loudly and profaned the Sabbath day with ostentatious laughter. A few shook their sagacious heads, intimating that they could penetrate the mystery, while one or two affirmed that there was no mystery at all, but only that Mr. Hooper's eyes were so weakened by the midnight lamp that they required a shade. So you can see here that there's like 5 or 6 different kind of interpretations. Everybody's looking at the same thing. If you remember my Moby Dick episode where we talked about the gold doubloon nailed on the mainmast, and everybody sort of sees something different in it, okay? So I think definitely Hawthorne is kind of teaching his readers here, like, how to read his sort of fiction, which later he's going to call American romance fiction or romance fiction. And this is, like, the idea is that there's going to be probably purposeful ambiguity built into this, so that you're sort of faced again with the challenge of, doing the work of interpretation for yourself and trying to sort of resolve, like, is there authority in this thing or not? Okay, after that, he goes to a, he first goes to I think first First, it's a funeral. So right after the sermon, he goes to a funeral. And it's like, this could be appropriate, right? Like, you've got the veil of mourning at a funeral. It's not too weird. Although the funeral is for a young woman. And this is the section that Poe very famously sort of said that, a lot of readers will miss this. He says something like, but only readers with minds congenial with that of the author will perceive that the veil was like a reference to a secret sin or a crime committed with regard to this young lady who died. So like maybe, but there's not much there. There's this one scene as they're carrying the coffin or whatever, the casket to the burial spot, where there's this procession of people, in the village going to the funeral. And one of them says, why do you look back? And the other says, I had a fancy that the minister and the maiden's spirit were walking hand in hand. And so had I, said the other at the same moment. So that's maybe, but that's it. Like, there's nothing else said about that. And then after that, he goes to a wedding to officiate. Now, this is weird, right? Like, you imagine your wedding, but you've got this minister who's got this thing on his face. And like, it's kind of one of those scenes where probably someone should have asked him right away, but they didn't. And then it just gets awkward, and he's going to leave this thing on from now on. Okay, so let's see. So he keeps the veil on all the way through the wedding, and that makes everybody kind of freaked out. And then it says that he's got this either like fiance or wife, I think wife to be, it seems. And she finally does confront him about this on his face, and she says, no, there's nothing terrible about this piece of crepe, except that it hides a face which I am always glad to look upon. Come, good sir, let the sun shine from behind the cloud. First lay aside your black veil, then tell me why you put it on. And like, this is the question of the whole story. It's not so much the thing itself as the motivation, right, behind it, the meaning behind it. It's like, why is he doing this that's driving people crazy? And Hooper, it says, Mr. Hooper's smile glimmered faintly. Remember, like this, right? He just kind of gives you the Sphinx's smile there. And he says to his fiancée, there is an hour to come when all of us shall cast aside our veils. Take it not amiss, beloved friend, if I wear this piece of crepe till then. And so, like, what? Right? She says, your words are a mystery too. Take away the veil from them at least, right? Like, she at least wants him to say, fine, if you want to leave this stupid thing on your face, like, explain why you're doing it. And he says, Elizabeth, I will, so far as my vow may suffer me. Know then that this veil is a type and a symbol, and I am bound to wear it ever, both in light and darkness, in solitude and before the gaze of multitudes, and as with strangers, so with my familiar friends. No mortal eye will see it withdrawn. This dismal shade must separate me from the world. Even you, Elizabeth, can never come behind it. This is like, to me, this is heavy to me these days, because I am not a fan. Like, I have like a psychological anxiety about the masks. I don't like it. I think it's weirdly anti-human, but I look around and no one else seems to have this problem with it. Like, everyone else is like, what's the big deal? It's not an imposition. Who cares? Well, I like faces, I guess, more than you do or something. I don't like the fact that you can't see the cashier at the grocery store, or, or like whoever, the parents of your children's friends or something when they come. It's strange to me, the whole thing that we're doing. And so, Hooper seems to be not even particularly comfortable with wearing this thing, but he seems, for some reason, he's taken a vow to do this, right? And so this starts to beg the question, is there like a symbolic meaning in his mind? Like, a vow means that it's, sacred for some reason to him. Later, still speaking to Elizabeth, he says, if I hide my face for sorrow, there is cause enough, he replied. And if I cover it for secret sin, what mortal might not do the same? So he's sort of saying, think what you want, right? It could be that I'm mourning something. It could be that I'm hiding but who couldn't do the same? And so Elizabeth gets kind of mad at him, and she kind of can't stand for it. Um, he sort of pleads with her then. He says, "Have patience with me, Elizabeth. Do not desert me, though this veil must be between us here on earth. Be mine, and hereafter there shall be no veil over my face, no darkness between our souls. It is but a mortal veil. It is not for eternity. Oh, you know not how lonely I am and how frightened to be alone behind my black veil. Do not leave me in this miserable obscurity forever." She says, "Lift the veil but once and look me in the face." And he says, "Never. It cannot be." Okay? And so she leaves, then farewell. And so from then on, nobody makes the effort to get this thing off of Hooper's face. It just is going to go on forever. It says that, children fled at his approach. He was even afraid of his own reflection in the mirror. It takes on this kind of horrible aspect to it. And nevertheless, it does say that the black veil had this one desirable effect of making its wearer a very efficient clergyman. This is fascinating to me. It says, by the aid of his mysterious emblem, he became a man of awful power over the souls that were in agony for sin. His converts always regarded him with a dread peculiar to themselves, affirming, though but figuratively, that before he brought them to celestial light, they had been with him behind the black veil. Its gloom indeed enabled him to sympathize with all dark affections. Dying sinners cried aloud for Mr. Hooper. So part of what you see here is that in the veiling of the face, there's a kind of authority created. This actually reminds me of like the inner sanctum of the Holy of Holies, behind a curtain, behind a wall. Or like I was watching The Crown this weekend. I think it was in episode 1 where they show the Queen's coronation. And this was all televised, which, some people were against even televising the event. This is in like 47 or something. And because they said like televising it sort of desecrates the sacredness of the event. But at the moment when they anointed the head of the new queen, which is the like sacred moment where she becomes queen, they actually cut the television footage and put in like a veil, basically, so that people couldn't see it. And of course, this is like it does suggest that there's like that you can create authority by a kind of by like a technique of complicated rituals. There's even a scene in The Crown where they talk about how this ritual is so complicated that no assembly of like lawyers and theologians and whoever else could put together exactly what it means. It's too complicated. The ritual has so many layers to it that it just becomes kind of mystery. But out of that mystery is born authority, right? So that seems to be maybe part of the theme of what's going on in this story. And I think it's part of what Hawthorne himself is doing as a writer. When you think of authorship, you think of authority. They're the same word. Part of what Hawthorne has figured out, I think, is that like people are more inclined to think of you as a profound writer, as a person with something to say, if you kind of, hold your cards close to your chest a little bit. Like, don't maybe show them all the things, okay? So, but again, like that's maybe part of what's going on in the story. I don't feel like that's necessarily what's happening with the COVID mask. These seem to be a different sort of thing psychologically. In any case, I'm just going to tell you how this story ends. Basically the rest of his life passes. He loses all his friends. He's lonely. And on his deathbed, the minister of Westbury shows up and finally says to him, like, he tries to like butter him up. He's like, you're such a good guy, so now we can finally remove the veil on your deathbed. He kind of wants to see behind it. And, Hooper, with his last ounce of strength, sits up and goes like, never, on earth, never, or something. And it's this like crazy moment. And as soon as he does it, the minister of Westbury, I think it's Reverend Clark, like falls back and, says, "Dark old man, with what horrible crime upon your soul are you now passing to the judgment?" So I mean, that's his interpretation, but it's not exactly clear that he's correct that's what's happening here. And then finally, it says Hooper's breath heaved, rattled in his throat. He's about to die, and he gives his final speech. Now, again, Poe says this is only what hoi polloi readers will. Oh, hold on. Am I still going? Yeah. This is only what hoi polloi readers will take to be the meaning of the story. This isn't the real deal, but I think it's worth reading here. Hooper says to, and Elizabeth is there too, his wife from years and years ago, or his fiancée, and this Reverend Clark, and I think maybe one other minister are all there at the deathbed. And they say, or he says to them, "Why do you tremble at me alone? Tremble also at each other. Have men avoided me, and women shown me no pity, and children screamed and fled only for my black veil? What but the mystery which it obscurely typifies has made this piece of crepe so awful? When the friend shows his inmost heart to the friend, the lover to his best beloved, when man does not vainly shrink from the eye of his Creator, loathsomely treasuring up the secret of his sin, then deem me a monster for the symbol beneath which I have lived and die. I look around me, and lo, on every visage, every face, a black veil." And it's like, oh, I see. Like, yes, like what he sees is that everybody's doing this. It's not just him. He's not just some eccentric minister. In fact, all he did is sort of manifest or like make physical an inward spiritual reality, which is that everybody's doing this. Everybody's walking around with, like veils on their faces, right? Which is to say they're hiding part of who they are. And so the idea becomes like, oh, I see. He says, I'm not a monster any more than you are with your best friend from whom you hide certain truths, or from your wife or husband from whom you hide certain truths, or your children, right, from whom you hide these truths. Like basically, when you all stop doing that, I'll take the veil off. And you won't, because seems to be part of human psychology as far as Hawthorne understands it. Now, it's interesting because like I had a conversation about this once with a buddy who told me, he said, no, this isn't true. I don't have any secrets with my wife, for example. And I was like, well, come on, haven't you ever like seen a hot babe walk by and you don't say it to your wife? And he goes, I actually do. And it's like, whoa, I don't know if that's good or bad. It's pretty weird though, in a sense, because like I don't really want my wife telling me that. If she sees some guy that she thinks is hot, like basically keep it to yourself, right? And there are other sorts of lies that you might tell, sort of, like to protect the feelings of others or something. And so in Hawthorne's mind, like ultimately, we're all kind of Venn diagrams that maybe overlap a little, but not enough that we're going to really know each other. And it's a scary thought. It's a scary thought at the end of this story. So that, let me just read you the last paragraph, which I think is sort of beautifully written. He says, so I guess he dies here. While his auditors shrank from one another in mutual affright, Father Hooper fell back upon his pillow, a veiled corpse, with a faint smile lingering on the lips. Still veiled, they laid him in his coffin, and a veiled corpse they bore him to the grave. The grass of many years has sprung up and withered on that grave. The burial stone is moss-grown, and good Mr. Hooper's face is dust. But awful still is the thought that it moldered, or like rotted, beneath the black veil. So that's the story. Now, what do I think? I think about this story that, first of all, there seems to be, in fact, there's a really interesting book, that David Hevall might like. I don't know who else would really be into this, but there's a book called Hawthorne's Shyness. And the argument in the book is that basically Hawthorne developed this theory of like human psychology related to morality that actually sort of boosted the ethos of shyness to a positive moral good. That is to say, whereas like usually in America, we value, extroversion and like charisma and openness and candor and, Mark Twain. Hawthorne suggests that like maybe there's another like there's virtue in being essentially shy, although again shy as a word has like a negative connotation, but he's basically saying it doesn't need to have that negative connotation. So that seems to be part of what I think, like what fascinates me about this story. And I think the idea there would be a certain amount of shyness like makes possible like more careful listening and perceiving or something. And if you've ever had like a friend or like a loved one who is introverted and quiet, I mean, I don't know, maybe this isn't how you react to it, but like my reaction to that is that it sort of tunes my senses more carefully, because I have to like slow myself down, like give them like consciously give them more of an opportunity to speak, not impose on them, not assume that they think the same thing I do. This is all part of this like distance that Hawthorne proposes between people. In that book I think it was by Clark Davis, Hawthorne's Shyness, he makes a big deal about Emmanuel Levinas. And Levinas was that Jewish philosopher, semi-theologian guy, and his whole his idea was that ethics is like sort of the first or the foundation for philosophy, which I don't know, seems kind of questionable to me. I've always thought of metaphysics as being first. But anyway, he says ethics first. And that he says that the foundation of ethics actually exists in the face. So it's like in these face-to-face conversations with others, we're sort of called to interpersonal duty. It's a very vague claim in my mind, but it was very, it was one of, I mean, he's in the succession after sort of Derrida and the postmodernists, and a lot of people in academia got into Emmanuel Levinas's thinking 20 years ago, and I think some still are into it. And so it fits very well with this idea of, the veil and the distance between people and the problem of like secrecy, or, yeah, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, to think, it doesn't have to be secrecy. This sounds a little darker than it needs to be. It's more like just, like, there are so many people, for instance, online with, avatars instead of faces. And it does seem to be true that it's easier to be, it's sort of easy, it's like, it's morally easier to be an avatar. If you just have an avatar, you can say whatever you want because there's no backlash, and because of that, you kind of, I don't know, it's not a real self, I think. It's not a real self until you've got your face sort of trying to say what you really think. That seems to be part of the psychology of avatars, or the e-personality or something. So like what can we say about all this if, like, in relation to these COVID masks? I mean, like I said, I'm not making a judgment about like the utility of them in terms of preventing disease, although it doesn't seem to be, the studies are kind of iffy on that, I guess. But and this is where, like, I'm sure YouTube will put like a warning label under this video or something. But see, it's like so much of this stuff with the COVID protocols here. It's like okay, like some old people are gonna die if we don't all stay indoors and wear masks and stuff. And I mean, that's sad, you guys. Like, that is a sad thing. We should really think about that and not make, a joke of it. It's, you gotta weigh the pros and the cons and stuff. But like, no one seems to be talking about the cost that's sort of sunk into living according to this weird lockdown. I mean, we're on like a year at this point. And I don't know, like a lot of the people I know are kind of just like, yeah, well, just 2 more weeks and then it'll be over, or, but it's like, of course it won't be over. I can kind of feel it coming, right? There's going to be a new strain, like a mutant strain of it again, and then we'll all need new vaccines, or the vaccination, like, what do you call that? The immunity conferred by the vaccination probably will only last 6 months to a year, so you'll have to get this like rotating vaccine, and then enough people won't take it, that there'll be this kind of finger wag from the media that'll always be like, you could go outdoors and show your faces to each other if only you'd get the vaccines and stuff. So it feels to me like this is going to go on and on forever. And there's very little discussion, certainly in the mainstream, about like the psychological cost of this. Like, for example, I'm homeschooling my kids this year because it seemed so, like, I didn't like the idea of sending them to schools where they were going to be socially distant all day and wearing masks all day and washing their hands all the time and not allowed to touch other people all the time. That just seems like really kind of dark to me. But weirdly, it doesn't to most of my neighbors. You know, they seem not so interested in worrying about it. They just think, yeah, that's the next thing. So it'll be interesting to see how it all kind of shakes down. But if, you know, I mean, I'm trying to get a job again, and then I got to send my kids back to school, I guess. And this, so it's like, I guess they go back to school wearing the equipment, and this becomes the new normal very quickly. And, you know, I don't know. Like, I remember actually, interestingly, in like January or February, I got into doing some quick research on, like, you know, just Google Scholar stuff, maybe JSTOR a little. I was looking for scholarly articles, like probably in psychology journals or something, that would be about the psychology of mask wearing. Now, it's not perfect, of course, because, you know, before the year 2019, a mask usually meant not a medical mask, but like some sort of costume-looking mask or something. But yeah, I found a number of articles about that, and they were very interesting. They said that, you know, masks are associated with things like ego death, psychological rebirth or change. I'm struggling to remember more of what I read, but it's like, there's like stuff going on here. You know, where is the Carl Jung scholar to suggest to us that masks are changing our sense of selfhood or something? You know what I mean? Like, it's not a nothing. This is a significant, major change to culture. And like, at least if you take Hawthorne's story as kind of a, I don't know, like a cornerstone for the argument, it changes the way people relate to each other. They don't trust each other as much. There's a certain like aloofness that takes over as the baseline for socializing. I mean, you know, you think about like, I understand that we were already at a phase in culture where it was easy to walk into the grocery store and kind of just keep your head down and barely make eye contact with the cashier and stuff. So we were already kind of doing this. But to like formalize it so that I genuinely can't tell sometimes what the person is saying, or like, you know, there's these confusions about what, like, I remember when I went to get a Christmas tree this year, there was a guy with the mask putting the tree on the car, and he was like saying something to me, and he said, you know, I asked him about putting it up there myself, and he goes, he said, no, we had a guy in here who came in to murder, he wanted to murder himself, and I was like, what? Like, I thought he said murder himself, and it was like, so I wanted to like pull the mask down and be like, what are you saying, man? I cannot understand what you're saying. And this affects not just that moment, because it's like that moment makes you a little disinclined to have another exchange like that, because it's awkward and it's just whatever. So this is all, like I said, this is just me probably feeling, you know, like a sensitive person, whereas, you know, 90% of people don't care about it. But anyway, I thought I would end this by just talking about, I once published in this book a chapter on the Scarlet Letter, and I thought the first paragraph is maybe helpful to some of my listeners who are kind of like, you know, I don't know, sort of half readers, or interested in reading but haven't read it themselves yet, or aren't, you know, don't have PhDs in literature or something. So this book was kind of written for like high school senior level people. And so it says, the aphoristic moral appearing near the conclusion of Nathaniel Hawthorne's tale of Hester Prynne, be true, be true, be true, has been celebrated for the way it crystallizes the major moral concerns of the Scarlet Letter. But the second part of the injunction, viewed in relation to some of Hawthorne's own theorizing about his aims and motives, significantly obscures the picture. So in the book it says, be true, be true, be true. Show freely to the world, if not your worst, yet some trait whereby the worst may be inferred. End quote. There is clearly a pessimistic implication here that living truly involves keeping our worst on public display. But simultaneously, there's the suggestion that such public display may be or seem impossible, presumably either because it is prohibited or, more provocatively, because what is worst may be something inner, something psychological, something with no precise material reality. In such cases, the voice of the moralizing narrator advises readers to show, and here some creativity may be required, show some outward characteristic that hints at the worst of the inner psychological or spiritual disorder. In short, there is a specific claim here about the nature of reality. That is, what is real and true may need to be transfigured by some symbolic process before it can be perceived by others. If that were all, it would be moderately sophisticated and maybe eccentric as a summation of Hester's story. But in his maturity as a writer, Hawthorne had developed a theory of fiction, even a theory of psychology, that encouraged readers not to settle for mildly profound moral propositions. Instead, Hawthorne hoped that some readers might, as he put it near the beginning of The Custom House, that's the intro chapter in The Scarlet Letter, quote, understand him better than most of his schoolmates and life-mates. For Hawthorne, explicitly, this proposed relationship with an ideal reader, replete with symbolic, signifying, and unspoken moral, psychological, even theological insinuations, formed the cornerstone of his highest authorial hopes and the bedrock of what he believed to be a distinct form of fiction that he called romance. So the romance, I mean, you can read about this. The most interesting source for it is probably his preface to The House of Seven Gables, just because it's like 2 pages and you can read it real quickly. But like I said, this is not just a like an effete kind of, or like an aesthetic. It's not just a nebulous concern for arty people. He's proposing that this is the way to get beyond the end of philosophy. That like philosophy reaches these kind of hard ends where you can say nothing more. Think of like Wittgenstein at the end of the Tractatus Logicus Philosophicus or whatever it's called. But here you can go beyond it by talking about by using narrative, because narrative can show through time what propositional logic has a more difficult time expressing, right? Because when you're making like truth claims about reality, you kind of have to anchor it in eternity or something, whereas fiction can show the change happen, and then that change itself becomes like almost like more important somehow. So I was thinking like last night about this project of like posting stuff about literature and the arts and whatever, and why I'm doing it. And what I said at the beginning of that Emerson episode, the last episode, was that like I'm trying to find some consistent thing that can last 5 generations, basically, right? And why 5 generations? I mean, it's kind of arbitrary. It would be nice if it was 10 generations or something. But I had this idea that like this is kind of how prophecy works, or like a prophet is born. When it's pretty simple. You just kind of like, all you have to do is just say to somebody, you can make a prophet like this. I'll make you a prophet right now. Write down something that was just as true 40 years ago in, what would that be, 1980, at 80 or 81. Just as true then as it is now. Okay, so you're going to try to identify something that 40 years ago was 100% true, and it's 100% true now. That is, it hasn't changed at all. We all agree on this thing. Now, there's a lot of things that have changed, like significantly since 1981, but we got to be able to find something that hasn't. Okay, so that's step one. Now, step 2 would be to write down something that's true now and that will also presumably be just as true in 2061, so 40 years from now, okay? Now, that could be whole other things than the 1981 thing. But what you're looking for then ultimately is to find the overlap in the Venn diagram where there's something that was true in 1981 that will also be true in 2061. And if you can't do that, then you're basically looking at a world without meaning, because all things change constantly, and it's like, why even get attached to anything? Basically just like be Buddha, detached. There's no self, nothing matters. It's all, who cares? You're just kind of here, and then you're not. Like, there's nothing to worry about much. But that is not the Western tradition. That is not where I'm coming from. I believe in truth. Like, I understand the whole thing about postmodernism and perspective and all that, but no, because if you go so far as to sort of like land on that stone, then who cares? Like, stop it. It wouldn't be worth your effort to make a podcast with 40 or 60 episodes about the Western tradition, because you know that it's getting steamrolled. None of it'll be saved, So I don't know. Like, I guess for me, it would be really nice if we could find some things that don't change through the generations. By the way, my guess is that it's not very easy to find something now that will be true in 2061. For instance, if in 1981, if you had said, well, I don't know, marriage will always be the same, you would have been wrong, right? So chances are, whatever you think you're going to identify now as true and unchanging forever, it'll probably be changed by 2061, because that's how democracy and empire seem to deal with stuff. So it's not the easiest thing in the world, but a prophet should be someone who's able to kind of identify the few things that don't ever change and focus on those. That's where we want to be. That's the stuff in life that does matter and that makes it meaningful. Okay, I might even do a live stream later today. I've got more ideas on my head lately, and they're not exactly this book or that book, but just stuff to shoot the breeze about. And then the next secret live stream for patrons only will be on January 15th. So there's still time. I'll put the Patreon link in the description here below. And I think that's all I've got for this episode. Listen to the outro music before you go. See you next time.